Welcome, everyone. I'm Shannon McCracken, CEO with the Nonprofit Alliance, and we're very happy to have you here today on this special session talking about artificial intelligence, how nonprofits are already using it, and what the path looks like for our future. We are recording this session, and we will make the recording available to you afterwards. It will also be on our website. And I want to just very quickly hand things over to our presenters so we can dive right in. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please use the chat box, enter those there. We'll be monitoring that and we'll address some of the questions as we go or save some time for the end so we can make sure to probably catch all of them. With us today, we have Tim Sarrantonio, who is Director of Strategic Partnerships with Neon One. Tim, I think you've been there since 2011. Neon One provides services and consultation for nonprofits. And that's a very simple way of saying something that's probably much more complex than a longer list, but that's my sum up for Neon One.
Pretty good summary, yep.
Perfect, I'll write your copy for you. And we have Jared Sheehan, who is CEO of PwrdBy. And PwrdBy, and I'm going to use my cheat sheet and read this, self-described as a social impact incubator, which is creating next-gen technologies for nonprofits. So Jared and Tim, wonderful to have you here today. I know this is a topic that you know and love, and we're pleased to be able to tap into your expertise.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And this is, it's really exciting. This was definitely a labor of love for both Tim and I as we were writing this paper last year, and a lot of thoughts have gone into this. But I think one of the core things that we always like to talk about when we first start on this particular topic is there's a lot of things that are happening related to artificial intelligence right now. Some that people are aware of, some that people aren't aware of. One voice that hasn't been quite as loud in the particular space of artificial intelligence is the nonprofit voice. So really a lot of our research and what we're trying to do here is to really focus in on how do we drive value in the nonprofit space. And part of that value is understanding what the space, what is happening in the space, where the space is going, and how do people feel about it? Are they okay with it? Are they engaging with it? Those sort of things. So those are the main topics that we'll talk about today. So we'll give a little bit of background on ourselves, probably not too much. Shannon did a great job. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is artificial intelligence. And for those who already know, it'll probably be a little bit of a refresher course. And then we'll move into nonprofit practitioner perceptions and basically how do people feel about artificial intelligence in the nonprofit space, current trends in nonprofit AI, and then we'll move into future-looking investment trends and the future of AI. And if we have questions in the middle, Shannon, feel free to just jump in and we can answer those as we go. And or if you want to save until the end, we can do that as well. So we're pretty flexible guys when it comes to answering questions. So. Yep. As Shannon mentioned, CEO of PwrdBy, so we do a lot of different social impact projects. As an example, actually I'll give you an artificial intelligence example. We've been working with an organization out of Canada, and they have been doing machine learning and artificial intelligence related COVID modeling right now. So very, very prescient topic that has been happening. And so we've been looking at identifying not just first, but second and third potential peak waves and trying to use large data sets to be able to figure out when and where those sort of things happen. So we do a bunch of different things, work with a number of different nonprofits, particularly children's hospitals, and leverage a lot of our experience to do that. Tim, you want to chat about yourself for a second?
Yeah. And so I'm Director of Strategic Partnerships at Neon One, and kind of the role that I do there is to help facilitate the larger technology and services ecosystem that we have, because we do a few different things. We provide a CRM, we do giving events, peer-to-peer fundraising, client case management, arts and ticketing. But what's fascinating when it comes to artificial intelligence is that we're seeing nonprofits employ it in some pretty obvious ways that we'll get into. And as a fundraiser, there's a lot of stuff that excites me that has potential here. But we're also able to apply it to the program side, which I think is very important too, because at the end of the day, everything when it comes to AI still needs to lead just like everything else back to an organization's core reason for being. And so that's what I'm excited to unpack. But my background's fundraising, so my mind always does go there. But I'm excited to talk about some of the other elements that are happening in the program side too. So that's me.
Awesome.
And I have 3 children, and if one of them runs into the webinar, it's going to happen. So there you go.
All right. So let's start off with what is artificial intelligence. Again, this is meant to be just a very simple version of this conversation, but at a really basic level, artificial intelligence is anything that is a computer trying to do things that a human can do cognitively better than humans can do it, right? So that can include a few different things. And there's a lot of these things that are probably happening in your life today. So in the example we show below here, you see Google Home or Alexa. Those are all driven by some version of artificial intelligence. And really all that's saying is it's different ways that computers are identifying to act more like humans. Because the challenge with computers at the end of the day is they're circuit boards. They're yeses and nos. Really what an artificial intelligence is, how do they add more context and all of those softer things that humans can do and try to figure out different ways to do that. And truthfully, the only way that they can actually do that is have a whole bunch of data. So AI at the simplest level has been around for 50 plus years, but it's one of those things that it hasn't really become something that we could do a lot with until recently because of data. Data is the new oil. There's a lot been written about it. Artificial intelligence was first created a long time ago, and it's one of those things that's just training computers to do more. In the 1980s, you then had machine learning. And really the idea behind machine learning is essentially teaching a computer to do something over and over again and slowly teaching itself, playing chess, playing AlphaGo, or any of those sort of things. The one that's really most exciting today is this concept of deep learning. And the reason deep learning is really interesting is because it actually gets into the neural pathways of how a human brain works and tries to mimic those things. So essentially a good example of that is, Google wanted to create a way to be able to do new translations. And so they said, hey, we're going to create this bot that's going to go in and try to figure out how to translate every language there is out there. And what the bot ended up doing without anyone training it how to do it, it created its own language that translated all the other languages into its language and then retranslated them back to other languages, because that was the way that it figured out as the quickest way to do that. And no one taught it to do that. It was just thinking through all the different possible alternatives and came up with that. So that's what deep learning does. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. What I will say is deep learning is probably the one that is most talked about scientifically and is least understood and is least used right now with anything that's happening. So the other thing we want to talk about is what is the state of AI in the nonprofit sector? And you'll hear us say SANES every so often, which is just the acronym version of it. But what we really wanted to do is we wanted to look at four things. So we wanted to look at how people perceive AI, what is happening in AI, where is AI going, and where are dollars being spent in AI. All of these relate to the nonprofit sector. And to do that, what we did is we went and surveyed over 200 people. So it's the largest survey of AI in the sector. We did a very thorough meta-analysis and looked at a bunch of different resources. We did an investment review, and then we spoke with a number of leading experts and people who are actually building AI and went through and identified a number of conversations and trends that are happening. So a bit of a meta-analysis, a bit of a primary research sort of organization. And what you're getting on the outcome of that is essentially going through those specific pieces. So let's start with AI perceptions. So how do nonprofit practitioners perceive AI? And what we did to understand this is we used a concept that's called diffusion of innovation theory. And it's by a communications professor, Everett Rogers. And the idea is that whenever a new technology is coming around, there's this concept of communication of diffusion of innovation. So there are the people who are the innovators, who are on the cutting edge, the Elon Musks of the world, if you will, who are constantly trying to figure out the newest and best ways to do any of those sort of things. But to actually trickle that throughout an entire population, you have a normalized curve of people who have to be able to understand each of those different pieces. And so we want to take the same approach, and there is a psychological approach that you can go to identify this information to be able to understand each of the different categories. And without going into too many detail for each of them, essentially you have to think of the innovators, the people who are always the most cutting edge and trying to find everything new. The early adopters are listening to the innovators, but typically they're a little bit farther behind. They're willing to try new things and try to get those new adoptions happening. The early majority is much slower to adopt, much larger group of folks, and they typically listen to the early adopters. The late majority are saying, no, we don't want to do that. That's the people who still may not have a smartphone sort of thing, or have just recently gotten a smartphone as an example. And then the laggards are the people that are a little bit left behind. And that's not to say that in a rude way, more so it's the people who are geographically disconnected from other people who may not even have a cell phone, those sort of things. And this is the population that Everett Rogers figured out was the skewing of all this data. You're going to see that our information is a little bit different in the nonprofit sector, but we'll explain why that is. Just want to give some background. So our respondents, so you'll note here that we heavily self-identified as hard on the innovator and early adopter side. Now, why is that? Well, all of our research we did through online resources, and we're talking about artificial intelligence. So for people who maybe are just learning what artificial intelligence is or don't have a really good grasp of it, probably was a little bit scary of a topic to talk about with some of those folks. And the people who are more interested in it are the people who are going to be thinking about early adopter and innovator status as they're looking at those sort of things. We also talked to a number of nonprofit tech organizations, you know, N10 and a lot of folks there, AFP and a lot of the technology relationships there. And then Tim and I just both work in technology. So there's a natural skewing of that. But what's interesting is, I think what's nice about this is that if it skews slightly on the innovator side, it means that we're looking a little bit ahead. So if we're talking to the innovators and the early adopters, what we're seeing here is kind of a 6 to 12 month ahead look. And that's kind of how we're thinking about the skewing of the distribution. So who are these people? So we see, you know, about 20% of folks are fundraiser partnership folks. We see 19% are program managers. We had a number of C-suite people, executive directors and CEOs were 15%. A large portion of data managers, 11%. And then we have marketing, and then we have a bunch of other ones, right? We have admin, we have C-level, volunteers, others, and prefer not to answer. So a pretty good distribution across various roles in the nonprofit sector, which turned out pretty well. Also, in terms of work expertise, we had a pretty normal distribution of everyone's work experience, with 6 to 10 years being the highest number of people, but this is a pretty normal looking curve here. And then finally, we asked them 5 specific areas of questioning around diffusion of innovation. So the theory of diffusion of innovation goes in 5 stages. It basically says, what's your knowledge? How do you get exposed to something? Imagine the first time you read an article about what a cell phone was, right? Or what the internet was, right? That's knowledge, right? And then you have to create an attitude around that, right? You have to be persuaded that that is interesting or new. And then this is the really hard one, that decision. You have to say yes or no. I'm going to try this or I'm not going to try this. I want to use Google's Smart Compose email, or I don't want to use Google's Smart Compose email. I want Facebook to be able to use my images to be able to identify who I'm friends with or not. Those are all versions of artificial intelligence that you're allowing or not allowing as part of this conversation. And then you have implementation. That's actually doing something about this. And we'll think about that from a organizational implementation aspect. And then finally, you have confirmation, which basically means once you have implemented artificial intelligence, then do you actually see value from it? And if it's valuable, then you'll actually see, and if you can go down this entire pipeline and get to the confirmation stage, and the population generally gets to that confirmation stage, what happens is you'll see more and more people do those sort of technologies. And with artificial intelligence, we're already seeing that in a variety of different sectors. We're seeing people who are getting to the implementation and confirmation stage. Typically, they're very large organizations. They're the Microsofts, they're the Googles, the Facebooks, anyone like that. So that's a lot of those conversations. So here's some insights. So 1, knowledge, the first stage of this. And I think this might be Tim's favorite number, but nonprofits in general are learning about AI from their CRM providers. And if you're on this call right now, technically you're learning about AI from a CRM provider, because Tim, that's part of what Neon One does, right? And what honestly this tells Tim and I, and Tim, I'll have you jump in here in a second, but what this tells us is that CRM providers are a bit of a source of truth for a lot of nonprofits. They're so important to the organization that organizations are looking to them to identify new trends that are related to what they're doing. Tim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, we found that to be the case with a lot of different elements of technology, where it's such a backbone part of the organization's operations for most nonprofits that things are kind of centered around this database of truth, especially when it's projecting so much revenue for the organization that they have to rely on that type of thing. So I think that this is a good thing. I think also on the flip side, though, what CRM providers need to do is ensure that they are projecting out accurate information. And that's why we work with partners like Jared, because I gut check him for almost anything when I see something with AI. I go, what do you think about this? We talk constantly about it. And so we have to approach these types of things with that it's not some just a reason to sell somebody junk. right? Like that's not the point of this. AI should be helping people, and CRM providers should be looking at it from a way of like, what's going to make somebody's lives easier. So that's why I think that this is an encouraging piece of information, but properly, CRM providers should be working with people like Jared and other folks who are delving into AI explicitly. And we're going to see this later on in terms of who are the players on this in the space around that.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the next thing that we've learned from the knowledge space is that people who are learning about AI in the nonprofit sector are generally learning from tech champions in their organization. Again, I don't think this is going to be surprising anyone. Oftentimes whoever is that person who's spending the most time thinking about technology is identifying trends and passing those along to other people. A little bit interesting is, my boss and the board were the next two largest groups, and lesser were association members. And we actually, at the time, we were not working with the Nonprofit Alliance, so I'm assuming this number would go up dramatically because of this call, right? But the association members weren't identifying new technology trends related to AI as much. And I'm wondering if that's a topic conversation or something else. So we'd need to think about that more.
Yeah.
So the second question is persuasion, right? Does AI align with people's values? And overall, the answer is, between strongly agree and agree, people do think AI mostly aligns with their values, right? We're seeing over 70% agreement here, minimal disagreement, and no strong disagreement. And just some people saying, hey, this isn't applicable because we're not doing anything with it right now. So overall, people think AI agrees with their values and needs right now. So it's something that definitely is important to them. And then the second piece is, why does AI connect with it? And I think the big thing that people have noted in our survey is that organizational efficiency is most important. So people are excited to see AI as a way to reduce time spent doing things, whether that's fundraising or other activities. It's a way to say, how do we spend less time doing things? The other thing that people are asking about is, how do we spend more time fulfilling our mission? How can AI help drive us there? And we have a bunch of different examples of what that looked like. We'll talk about a few later, but we're definitely seeing a lot of things related to that happening. Which is really heartening. And back to Tim's original comment of everything should go back to the organizational mission and being able to drive that value. Now let's get to decision. So what is happening decision-wise related to AI? So 63% of people think they need more time with AI. 83% believe that they need an ethical framework in place before there's wider adoption, and half the people are scared of AI. Those are pretty powerful numbers. And I think the middle one for us is most important, because that really, asks the question of, well, what needs to happen before people trust AI? AI is a little bit of the Wild West right now. People are going about doing whatever they want to do, and it's not something that we really have a great ethical standard for right now. And there are a few organizations that are really trying to focus on this. And I highly expect in the next, 1 to 2 years, we're going to see more and more organizations doing that. One thing about the Nonprofit Alliance that we really appreciate is that they actually.
I'm all set, and I'll reach out if I need anything.
Oh, sorry.
That was my wife. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought someone was jumping in. One thing that's been really great about working with the Nonprofit Alliance is they actually have a data and ethics special interest group that is just targeted about talking about this topic right here. How do we think about having an ethical framework in place when we're thinking about privacy, data, and all the issues related to that? Tim, do you want to add anything on this particular one? I know this is an important one.
The ethical one, I think, is of the highest importance. And even when we get into the investment side of things, we're going to start seeing that more and more. But it's the 52% in terms of the scared side that I think there's a little bit of element of like pop culture skewing things, right? Like we think about like, basically if AI is put into a movie, it's never they think it's the Matrix, right? It's always something bad. And so, because AI for good doesn't, sell tickets basically. And I think that what's nice about what we did for the report and the information that we were able to find is that when you start to peel the onion back, that it's a lot more obvious that like, it shouldn't be scary. It's actually something that is going to help us. But I think that, as more and more people get exposed to what it actually is, then I think that number is going to go down, obviously. Yeah. So that's what I got to add there.
Absolutely. So if people say yes, moving on from the decision to actual implementation. So how are we seeing actual implementation of nonprofit specific AI? And the answer is it's pretty nascent right now. So what you'll see here, these first three items are Google Mail, Facebook, and Slack bots. These are not nonprofit specific, although nonprofits are leveraging them. And then this middle group here, we're seeing a number of different organizations that are building different AI versions. So Boodle is an AI one, Microsoft has some specific ones, Salesforce has some specific ones, Blackbot has some specific ones, and then our Amelia mobile application has some nonprofit, Neon Moves has some adoption as well. We're seeing a small percentage of organizations starting to adopt AI right now. We highly expect this number to blow up. And I would even say in the conversations I've had since doing this survey late last year, we've seen this number increase dramatically across all organizations that we've been talking with and partnering with on this particular topic.
And we did have a comment from our mutual friend, Sam Kaplan, by the way. He said, AI really needs a new name. All coding will be influenced by AI over time.
There you go. Yes.
There you go.
That is true. We agree with that, Sam.
Maybe we can use AI to figure out what the new name will be.
Yeah. AI for marketing.
Yeah.
Or just marketing.
Or just marketing. Yeah.
So for the people that aren't implementing AI today, why not? And I think the big things here is around actual support, technical support moving forward, and then cost to implement and skill set required. So what was interesting is we assumed it was either knowledge of the space or cost to implement initially, but really it's more about people organizations not having the right technical support or skill sets aligned for doing these sort of things. And, again, I considering the number of new AI-driven tech languages and tech courses and Coursera courses and all the things that are happening, I really think the skill set requirement and the need for technical support are going to go down dramatically. We're already seeing large organizations like Microsoft providing some out-of-the-box AI solutions that you can go and build some different things. Salesforce is doing some of those sort of things. So there's a lot of things that are happening related to AI that are going to reduce the barriers related to needing to know what you need to do to be able to do this and being able to implement on a cost-effective manner for nonprofits, which is really exciting. Tim, I don't know if you've heard anything different.
No, and I think it's interesting to see kind of just the parallel to what's happened in around how nonprofits were managing their data. Because when I first got into the industry working for Neon, I had worked for a bunch of different nonprofits themselves and then shifted over to work for Neon. And what I found was that at that time, back in 2011, a lot of people were like, well, why would my database be in the cloud? And basically in under a decade now, that's the go-to option. And so as I think that we're going to see something very similar when it comes to AI, is that as the technology gets easier to use and more embedded in our everyday lives, then it just is going to be kind of part of how we are, right? And so I think that's what is holding some people back. I think a lot of people back is that they're just like not completely sure how it fits into like their everyday lives. And what we want to stress is that it's already here and it is already part of our everyday lives. So I think that it'll get democratized. That's my hope.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing I would point out here is that privacy and security issues weren't actually the highest issues related when people were starting to implement. They weren't the highest issues. It was more about people who haven't yet gone into the implementation phase that thought those were the most important issues, which is an interesting decision-making framework as we think about this.
Absolutely.
And then finally, confirmation. The people who are actually implementing AI, is it making their life better? And overall, the answer is yes. Right? So almost 70% of people have seen visible results from using it. 75% believe it's made their life easier. And particularly in the innovators and early adopter area, they think that AI has made their life significantly easier, right? So as we go through each of these phases, we've seen various versions of innovators and early adopters. We've added in a few sprinkles here and there about the specific things, but I think the most important takeaway from the different phases of the diffusion of innovation theory is the fact that the people who are implementing it, are innovators and early adopters, really are seeing results right now. And I think that's what's going to happen is, the next time we have this conversation next year, what we're going to see is that it's not just the innovators and early adopters, but early majority, maybe even late majority, are going to start seeing confirmation similarly in terms of AI.
Yep.
Which is heartening. So where does AI stand today? And if you're a media junkie like me and you're constantly reading things, there are articles coming out all the time related to AI. A lot of them starting to be in the nonprofit sector. I would say that it's one of the ones that has been slower to adopt than other ones. But specifically where we're seeing AI is in two areas. And I think these make sense, right? So one is around mission-driven AI, and the other is around fundraising and marketing. And I think in the future, these two major categories are probably going to break into more categories. Maybe fundraising and marketing will be separate. Rather than just mission driven, there'll be different parts of it, right? Whether it's program specific or different aspects of it, organizational efficiency. But as of now, they're the two major buckets that they really fall into. So what does that mean? So a few examples of mission driven AI. Amnesty International did a really cool Twitter machine learning program that basically went through and looked at social media abuse on Twitter and brought up a number of different issues related to it, and then actually built out a way to be able to identify and try to respond to some of those areas. So basically saying, how do we make sure that we're not being abusive on Twitter? And for those that are, how do we target specific responses to be able to stop trolls, essentially, is the idea. The second example is using some of Google's AI, crisis intervention, created a crisis text line that individuals could go in and communicate with essentially a machine learning bot and be able to have crisis intervention conversations with folks and all the different pieces related to that. And then the third one is a really cool example of there's an organization that was specifically using AI to be able to tag and track elephant populations and then use that data, which was a ton of audio and visual data, and be able to map all that back to identifying elephant migration populations, so they could determine where elephants were going and where hunters were trying to go and find those elephants and all this specific things. So some really cool examples of AI here. There are a bunch more. I mean, with the COVID crisis that's been happening, there's Blue Dot that predicted some of the COVID transmission via different populations that happened, and some different things related to that. And we could go on a number of different avenues with this mission-driven AI, but just want to give a few examples to see what those look like in mission-driven AI. Tim, do you have any that you want to add to that?
No, I think these are, especially what I think we're going to see is around coronavirus, a lot of very interesting applications of this. So I think that's the biggest point to make here, is that we're all needing to adapt in a lot of different ways, and I think that people are going to get creative in how they apply AI. You're even doing some of that, and we've talked about how to even potentially identify fundraising communities, in terms of relating to what's happening with coronavirus. So yeah.
Yep, sounds good.
That kind of drills into and then we talked about some of the people who are actually doing mission-driven AI work, which is
right. And the answer is there are really just two groups that are doing it. One is large technology providers, and the Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Salesforce is doing some as well, though on the fundraising side. And then the other side of it is that there are large nonprofits that are building some custom AI models. So Amnesty International created the Twitter abuse information. Over here is OpenAI, which interestingly started as a nonprofit and has now built out a for-profit arm, but they're trying to do general AI, and that's a whole another set of conversations that we won't get into right now. And then you have a number of different organizations that are local community groups trying to talk about AI. So we're LA based, and LA AI LA is a organization that specifically focuses on artificial intelligence in the Los Angeles area. And then I would say the one organization that has had a very strong voice and is working with a number of different corporate partners, including the Microsofts and Amazons, is the Partnership on AI. And they spend a lot of time trying to think about what are the tenets of artificial intelligence and trying to think through some of those ethical questions related to it, which is we are big proponents of. So they're doing great work on it. And then on the other side is the fundraising side of it. So different examples of fundraising AI. And we'll just spend a little bit of time on this. So everyone is doing it differently. The three examples here we're showing are three different examples of fundraising AI. So the first one is Futurist Group. And what they're essentially doing is looking into patient experience data for healthcare systems and being able to identify potential grateful patients and using that as a way to help out nonprofits, specifically the foundation healthcare systems, identify who would be a potential donor for any of those healthcare systems using deep learning. So thinking about that big data section, they're actually going into that deep learning side of things. What we're doing at PwrdBy, one example of what we're doing at PwrdBy is helping fundraisers who are on the go actually focus on who they're going to talk to next and essentially plan their day for them. So being able to say, I have an hour, I have 2 hours today. I either want to talk to folks in Chicago, Illinois, or I want to talk to the people who are nearest to me, and being able to identify who those people are and where they are, and doing that for either corporate partner locations or individual donors, right? So we're using a machine learning algorithm to basically say, hey, the more that you do actions with your CRM and connect with your CRM and different things like that, then we can actually identify who you should talk to next and what that conversation could look like. And then finally, this Wisely example is one that they are looking into for major gift officers. They're specifically focusing on what's their portfolio look like and how do we use AI to be able to classify their portfolio and specifically target specific people at certain times. So just 3 different examples of marketing AI. These are all startup examples. Similarly, if we think about who's doing the fundraising AI, you again have large technology providers, and then you have a few startup companies, right? So you have Blackbaud's doing some things around it, Salesforce, Microsoft, Neon is doing some things around it, and then you have a number of startups, which we mentioned a bunch here, and then there are a few others. And the startups are actually still popping up left and right. I would say not as quickly over the last 5 months as I was expecting, but it's also a hard environment for startups to be starting right now. So, it might be one of those things that we see a hiatus of new AI startups in the next 6 months, but then they'll come roaring back in 2021. Tim, anything you want to add here?
No, I think what we're going to see is an acceleration of it once the benefits around revenue generation are very clear. That's the simple reality is that there's always shiny objects that are being put in front of nonprofits, and the quickest way to prove that something's going to work and that should be adopted and carried on is that it helped you raise more money. So,
right. Or helped your mission.
Or helped your mission, absolutely. Which in turn does help you raise more money, by the way, as a fundraiser.
Touche, yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll jump in with we have a question from one of the attendees. Are there any individual donor, direct response firms using AI to be more efficient with direct mail? So I know, for example, Arjuna is using it to help identify the right gift amount, ask at the right time for individuals. Are there some other good examples out there of how it's being used in traditional DM?
I've talked with the folks over at Pursuant who are kind of helping pilot that, some elements of that in terms of honing your list. I think calculated ask strings is a really great example of what that looks like in practice, but even direct mail, there's a few firms out there. I will say that whoever can figure that out is gonna be rocking it, because that's the one space that I think would really, really benefit from it too. But I think a lot of unfortunately, the firms out there, that's not really in their bailiwick yet. So there's a few companies out there, but the really big firms like Merkle, stuff like that, I'm not aware of any specific initiatives that they're doing there yet.
So maybe more coming through partnerships with some of the
I think so.
Like the ones on the screen right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and from my side of things, I know the Futurist Group is working with a number of direct mail organizations and using some of their deep learning algorithms related to that. I don't know if those are public, so I won't get into the names of those, but I know they are doing some work around that.
That's great. I get excited about that.
Oh, I think it's great. As a person who is a donor and receives mail that isn't relevant to you, it would be so much better if you were receiving the targeted donation when it makes sense, right?
Well, and especially to have it pull on data to potentially identify not just an amount, but the connection to the mission in a really authentic way. That would be very powerful.
Yeah.
So that's actually, I was going to save my question for the end, but you sort of segued right into it. So the Nonprofit Alliance has an initiative called Tell Us What You Love, which is really about, it's ask, collect, and reflect. So find out why I choose to support an organization through my money or my volunteerism, which is going to be different from the reason why Tim does and the difference why Jared does, and then reflect that in your communications with me, which can be on a major donor level, but it's really a mass marketing. In terms of AI and the future of AI, how powerful is that first party data versus, say, being able to go out to big data sources? I mean, is it, if organizations are thinking about AI as a future path for them or recognizing that's where they're headed, is that something, is that a reason to invest in this, like, first party asking right now? Or does big data have all the information anyway?
Do you want me to go with
Jared, I'm going to kick that over to you first.
Yeah, that's fine. So AI, similar to like a CRM, is the quality of the data that comes in dictates the quality of the data that comes out. So I think there are definitely some key indicators that can be used without any sort of conversation or asking component of it. I think there's a lot of wealth data platforms out there. I think the big data component related to them is still pretty nascent, and I think will evolve a lot in the next 12 to 24 months. And we're going to see a lot better targeting related to that, and better things, better aspects related to that. But at the end of the day, what I think you're describing is an experience conversation. And if you can create experience related data somehow, that's going to be really valuable for you. And I'll use Futures as an example again, right? They're trying to figure out what is the experience that you had when you engaged with specific parts of a hospital or doctors, and using that as a way to identify if someone's a grateful patient or not. And if there was a way that you could use machine learning to figure that out without asking them, then yes, it's possible that component of it would no longer be valuable. I have to imagine it'd be really hard to get there anytime soon, because AI isn't necessarily good at asking people for stuff unless you're thinking about like. It's all good, Tim.
There's the appearance.
I did promise that. I did promise it.
Good job delivering.
It's really hard for AI to ask some of those questions unless you're thinking about like chatbots and things like that. So, like an example, as we move towards a more telehealth sort of conversation, if you're starting to have conversations with your doctors via some sort of telehealth solution or messaging and things like that, you can start tracking some of that data and being able to feed that into that experience data. Does that make sense? So I think in the near term, asking for that information is going to be really important. And unless you have a really good data source, and typically with AI, you need a lot of data. So if you're talking to one donor one time, you're never going to have enough data to just have some sort of AI algorithm to be able to figure that out. If you have, hundreds of thousands or millions of donors, and you have many different data points from there, then AI might be able to replace some of that sort of stuff.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
There is a lot of fun, especially in the traditional fundraising consultant side, a lot of skepticism when it comes to like using AI to generate copy, for instance. And so,
I had that too.
Yeah, and I actually am prone to agree with that as well. Nothing, and realistically, what large big data sets can help with is to apply a tested model that then can be narrowed down to the individual organization's own needs and experiences. I think that's what we're also going to see there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
I think we're caught up for now.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Tim, when you want to talk about investment?
Yep. So what we're seeing is that the two ways that we could kind of frame this is that there's investment in AI in general that's happening, and then there's investment that relates to the nonprofit sector, and then there's also we talk about this from an investment standpoint of nonprofits. What are they investing? Okay, so on the first side, what we're going to talk about is kind of the bigger trends in terms of like actual grants, endowments, things like that. A recent analysis by the Chronicle Philanthropy found that there was $583 million invested specifically into from donors, foundations, things like that. That number has gone up since that report, though. Not by too much. So, but that number is actually increasing. Some really prominent examples in Canada, for instance. Gerald Schwartz and Heather Reisman, they invested $100 million specifically into the University of Toronto for the intersection of kind of AI technology, just kind of general research into it. Paul Allen, in his will, actually established the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence in 2018. So that's a pretty prominent example. He was one of the original folks from Microsoft. And so, you know, Bill Gates talks a lot about this too, obviously. So Microsoft is going to drive a lot of this in terms of the innovation. They're very, very interested in this. But then on the flip side, these are all like, yeah, AI is great. Reid Hoffman, connected to LinkedIn, actually established an ethics institute to say, whoa, hold up, we gotta study this. And there's a really interesting slide that we have around the spectrum of what people think of. A lot of technologists are actually very wary of the potential of AI if left unchecked. And so we'll get into that a little bit. But these are some pretty interesting examples. There's not just high net individuals, but foundations, a lot of them connected to universities in particular, that we're seeing a lot of the investment made. Now on the next slide, organizationally, when we were asking people, you know, what are you doing? How are you investing? You know, what was the spread? And pretty much without you know, too much surprise, especially some of the larger organizations were the ones who were more heavily doing it. So small organizations, they're kind of dipping their toes. They're starting to do it. I actually found it was interesting that the smallest organizations are doing it a little bit more than even some of the mid-sized folks. But you know, what was pretty evident across the board, though, is that almost everybody is going to invest in some sort of dedicated resource around artificial intelligence. Jared, do you have anything to add in terms of what we found in the study on this point?
No, I think that's a pretty good description of it. I mean, you know, overall, it's heavily predicated on the size of the organization, which is no surprise to anyone. It's purely a resourcing thing. And if you're thinking about innovation, that makes sense. What I think will be really interesting is, I speculate there are more organizations that are going to be popping up that are going to be AI focused in the next 4 years. So what may happen is those folks that are in the 5 to 30 range in organizational size, we might see more of those folks. So it might become a bit of a dichotomy where you're seeing the really large organizations and some very small organizations that are just very targeted on AI.
Mm-hmm. And I think also what we have to keep in mind is that it's an organization's self-identification of how they define AI. And going back to our original premise, there's so many things that are just, it's embedded into how we do things that eventually everybody's going to be doing it in some form. So on the next slide, a lot of the current operational usage of it is things that are either pretty obvious or behind the scenes. So the first one is chatbots. This is a really, really interesting one. We cited a few examples earlier relating to this, but going to an organization's website and, for instance, I need to find information about the programs that they do. And a chatbot could actually help automate a lot of the actual initial interactions until a human needs to step in. And so we're seeing that for both programs as well as event management. So before coronavirus, for instance, I saw chatbots utilize like Facebook Messenger chatbots, things like that, where it would help somebody navigate, okay, I'm going to do a 5K, and how do I find that information, right? So those are some of the things that we're seeing there. Another big one, and this is where Neon One is doing a lot of the back end investment around this, is for fraud protection for bad actors using credit cards, basically. So big data really, really comes into play here, because then it's like, okay, we can kind of identify that this IP address or these types of IPs or this location is more likely than not actually going to be fraud. Let's immediately shut this down, right? You don't need a human to actually sit there and review it. That the actual back-end database for the credit cards and ACH is automated in that way. So this is where we're doing a lot of our investment personally. And then fundraising, which is the front-end side of things. Jared cited a few examples. That's what we work on with them for Neon CRM, for instance. But I think that calculated ask strings, the things that we were talking about for for direct mail. Those are great examples of how this relates to the fundraising side. And so this is where we're seeing most of the money being spent when it comes to this type of stuff. So where are we going though, Jared? Where are we going to go with all this?
Tim, I think this is you.
Oh, this is still me. Okay. I mean, now we kind of get into a little bit of back and forth, right?
Yeah.
So the larger, okay, the future of, yeah, that's right. So apologies, it's not enough coffee in the world anymore. The reality is that in the nonprofit side, there's kind of larger trends that are happening that affect us as nonprofit professionals. And then there's things specific to the industry. So the larger trends are going to be just general, more money is going to be focused on investment around this. So as Jared was saying, there's going to be more firms that are going to start up that see an opportunity to help nonprofits specifically around artificial intelligence. So we're going to see more powered bys, basically. Educational investments. So we cited some of the universities. There's going to be more courses. There's going to be more, books and online learning and things like that. Webinars like this that are going to talk about how AI can impact a person's life and help their organization's revenue, things like that. Surveillance. Obviously, this is a big topic in terms of like, opting in to have Facebook use your face, basically, like to do things. Well, what are they using that for? Is that going to be used for something relating to law enforcement, right? Like that was some of the big concerns by privacy advocates and things of that nature. So that's just going to be lots and lots of conversations around this. And we're seeing a lot of it, especially around coronavirus, for instance, in terms of social media platforms trying to tamp down on harmful misinformation. So even though we put together the report and this presentation before coronavirus, that's an excellent example of AI in action, where it's like, okay, we're going to flag this article as something that's dangerous, that's promoting something that somebody should not be doing. Cyber attacks will go up. As the technology becomes easier to employ, there are going to be bad actors that actually end up using this. So what I think we're going to see around that is that as cyber attacks go up, as other things become more evident around this, then there's probably also going to come in turn more regulation around it as well. And so that's where we get into some of the data privacy things. There's going to be some big conversations that have already started happening. California, implementing some laws around this. India is doing some laws around, where data is even housed and stored and being able to access that type of information. Imagine this is going to affect things like wealth screening platforms too, right? It's like, I'm gonna opt out. We saw this with GDPR. And basically that means that if you don't want to be in a person's database, that you can get ripped out of it, as an opt-out, not just an email, but the actual name, address, the whole thing. And these are tools that we had to be compliant with at Neon One, for instance. So large governmental decisions, large policy decisions, ethical conversations, these are big questions that AI brings up. Now, when we look into the nonprofit sector specifically in terms of those larger trends, we're going to see things such as mission-centered AI applications. So we saw a few of those on the program side. I think we're going to continue to see that in terms of organizations who can invest in really interesting applications of technology to articulate their mission. That's going to be a really, really interesting thing. I think that's honestly what's going to drive a lot of the organizations to feel more comfortable with it. If they see, well, okay, this is actually what it can be used for, and this is specific to the nonprofit space, then that's going to be great. The money stuff is obviously going to be a big part of it, but I think that the program side is actually the one where it's going to get more adoption, actually excited around it. Given capacity, this is probably the biggest one that we're paying attention to at Neon One, is being able to just not only historically prospect databases are like, it's the fundraiser's job to sit there and look at the portfolio and figure out who they should call, right? And the reality is that by using data models to identify, do the things like what Jared's folks do with the Neon Moves app and Amelia. The reality is that given capacity for prospect research is going to be a big way that we see AI applied. Also basic routine tasks, right? Like think about how many calendar reminders that you might have to do something, right? Well, maybe we can implement something that streamlines this. So making people's daily lives easier, that's a big, big deal. Even something as simple as like, okay, the computer knows that once we hit this benchmark in terms of the campaign, to email me a campaign update report, something like that. Access to data. This is just big decisions that we're going to see in terms of who has access to what. Do volunteers get access to certain elements that might have sensitive information or things of that nature? Which staff members are controlling this? Do we have an IT plan, a data plan, a security plan? And then ultimately the ethical considerations that everybody needs to have around this when it comes to privacy, when it comes to what we're using the data for, what we're giving access around the data for. We all have to kind of stare in the mirror and ask these questions of ourselves. So that's what we're seeing specific to the nonprofit sector. And Jared, I want you to take this one because I know like you do a really good job summing up what's going on here.
Well, I think the final takeaway from all of the conversations that we've had, so AI is exciting, is new. There's a lot of possibility with it. If you've ever watched anything on Netflix, really, you've seen Black Mirror and all these dystopian versions of society and things like that. I think if we could say there's one major takeaway of how we think about AI today and where it's going to be going, is that no one, not the smartest people in any society right now, knows exactly what's going to happen with AI and where it's going to go. We know that it's not going anywhere, and we know that it's integrating into our lives more. Diffusion of innovation says in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be a part of our life and we won't even think about it anymore, potentially. As we do that, though, one of the roles of the nonprofit space is to have a voice for those who are voiceless. It's not the government necessarily. It's not the business world necessarily. It's those people that sometimes fall in between the cracks of them. And really, it's just a question of, and maybe a call to action, is as we think about AI and where AI is trying to go, I really am hopeful that the nonprofit sector is going to have a leading voice in definition of the ethics of AI, how we use that, when they use it. I would even go as far to say, wouldn't it be really cool if at some point in the near future, you actually had control of your own data and could determine who you want to give your data to? Do you want to give it to Neon? Do you want to give it to Target? Do you want to give it to Amazon? And those organizations have to figure out different ways to be able to do different data things and those sort of conversations. And I think AI is going to be the catalyst for a lot of that, because a lot of the things that are going to be happening are going to be data driven. If they have your name, they have your wealth information, they have your credit card information, and those sort of things, there's a lot of things that are going to be happening. And really this slide just shows that, right? You have thought leaders such as Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates saying, whoa, there's a lot of stuff going on here that we don't know about and we should be concerned about it. And then you have other folks that like Ray Kurzweil, who are, or Mark Zuckerberg, right? So that they want an AI butler or they want to be a cyborg. So you have a whole range of different perspectives on it. I speculate and hope that the nonprofit sector is going to be one of those ones that is going to help us figure out the actual ethical role of AI.
Yep.
And so that leads us into the last section, which is just a Q&A time. And if there are any questions, we have, it looks like 7 minutes to chat about those. And obviously you have our information afterwards if you guys want to email us at anything as well. So
as questions are coming in, going back to the stages of adoption, and your survey really leaned towards some of the early adopters. Let's assume some people in the webinar today are more in they identify, or their organizations identify with being in that late adopter group, which could be about they're perfectly comfortable where they are right now. Let somebody else kind of figure this out. Or it could go some of those barriers you talked about. One was cost, but then there was access to skill and access to technology, which is really also about cost. Right now, a lot of people are looking again at their budgets, given the current situation. I mean, our nonprofits, long lead into the question, are nonprofits who have been sort of the late adopter, we'll see what happens and then decide if we want to jump on board. Are they at risk of being left behind?
I don't think so. I mean, there's always first mover advantage to a certain degree. I think there are so many different opportunities to jump in at really a minimal cost perspective at this point. And think of it different ways. Think about specific use cases as one way to go. Think about learning opportunities as another, and think about piloting things as a third option, right? So if you wanted to use an AI platform, there are a bunch of different ways to do it, whether you're trying to do specific targeting on, Facebook or something like that, or using one of the nonprofit specific technologies that are out there. A lot of those things are fairly affordable. Some of them are premium products for large organizations, but a number of those are ones that you can go in and test out and try some different things to see if they help with fundraising. Is it one of those things you actually can talk to 10, 20% more people in a given year or something like that, and try that out. The second one is education, right? So thinking about it from if there isn't a person in an organization, in your organization, whether you're small or medium or whatever, that has some technical background, doesn't need to be the deepest technical person. A few online Coursera courses around TensorFlow, Amazon Web Services, whatever that is, pretty easy to Google and find some of those sort of things, can kind of get you to the point where you're starting to build some very simple AI things. Amazon and Microsoft both have very template ways to try some things out and see if there's any efficacy there. Are they going to be the best option? No, but it's a walk before you run sort of scenario, which it gets you into the third opportunity, which is how do you pilot some stuff? Yep. Right? There are a number of affordable ways to pilot some specific things and ways to do them cheap. And frankly, there's a bunch of people who are building AI or learning AI that are trying to do specific little projects that are posting things out there and trying to say, oh man, we'd love to help a great organization do something cool with their data. So, I think there's an opportunity to try some different pilots and things like that, even if you're a small organization. Now, obviously, as you have more budget, you can do more with it. And I would say be much more strategic if you're larger. If you have a lot of data and you're more strategic and you're larger, then spend more time on the front end thinking about what you want to do before you build the models. And when you build the models, test them a lot before you actually put them in action. Right.
And we did have a question in terms of you start saying success would feed the growth of AI in the nonprofit sector, but this attendee said they haven't heard us describe case histories of successful use of AI.
Any case histories? Well, so I would consider all of the mission-driven examples that we were showing there as successful versions of AI. So, being able to track elephant populations and reduce the amount of poaching that was happening is a great example of it. AI was used to identify a new planet. AI has been used to help identify breast cancer in a variety of different situations. AI has been useful to help identify COVID. I would say from a fundraising marketing perspective, you're going to see incremental value at this point around AI, which is to say you're not going to replace a fundraiser, but you might make them 10 to 20% more efficient in some of the different scenarios, particularly if you can help them identify who are the right people to talk to, when do they talk to them, and those sort of things. And that's some of the value that we've definitely been seeing, which is, we're seeing, a specific growth rate over a campaign for the people that are using our different AI platforms and things like that. So we'll see, a 20% growth rate over a specific time period, because it's usually those time periods when people don't have enough time because they're doing too many things. And so it's an opportunity for them to essentially let the computer program think for them and allows them to do an extra 10 or 20%, which drives some additional value.
We've seen, elements of automation and artificial intelligence for our clients where, they're saving hours and hours of time at their job. And yeah, that's not as, sexy in some ways of like, hey, I don't have to do as much work, but it's the practical things that we actually think are the most important in these cases too. Yeah. And I know you kind of talked a little bit about it, but somebody did ask if somebody's organization is doing nothing now, like where do you start? Where do you start? You kind of hit on that a few things, but what's a good where do you start? I think is.
Yeah, so here is a good spot. If you're interested in trying to figure out what you want to do with any of this sort of stuff, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to chat about it. It a little bit depends on what your organization is doing and how big you are, right? If you have if you're interested and willing to learn, there are, again, a ton of different information sources out there to find those sort of things. But what I would say is the best way to start is to have a problem or try some, by the way, you're probably already doing something related to AI right now. You're probably on Facebook or Google or something Microsoft related and don't realize it. I think more what you're trying to say is, or my assumption here, this is an assumption. My assumption here is that if there's a specific organizational problem, is AI but a potential solution to solve that organizational problem? And that's just really figuring out, okay, what is the problem? Do we have enough data to be able to figure out something related to AI to do that? And then how do we actually implement it? The how to implement it part of it, there are lots and lots of different ways, and there are a lot of simple ways to do that. What I would say is start off with those first two and have a really clear definition around it, and then just talk to someone who's been doing it, and they can point you in the right direction.
Well, we are at time. We do have another question that just came in, but we have the person who sent it. So Jared and Tim, perhaps you can follow up with him individually. Sure. And for everyone else, Tim and Jared's contact information is on the deck here. And again, we will make the recording available and send it out to all registered attendees. So thanks very much for being here, everyone. We appreciate you, and be well.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.